All right. Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us for this IFLA Science and Technology Library section webinar. My name is Kara Watley, and I'm a member of the IFLA STL Professional Development Subcommittee, and I will be your host for today's webinar. Today, we are discussing out in the open how the Jet Propulsion Laboratory Library is leading open science. And we have with us Caroline Coward, who supervises the daily operations of the library at NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory. And in her role there, she collaborates with scientists, engineers, and mission specialists in areas such as internal and external information curation. And Caroline is here today to talk to us about some recent work that they've been doing at JPL. Caroline, I'll be driving the slides, so just tell me when you would like me to advance it, and I will turn everything over to you.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Kara. And I want to thank the organizers of this event, Kara and her team, for inviting me to speak. This is a real honor and a privilege to speak to the STL group. And I'm very, very interested in what you all think and what you all have to say about open science. Today, I'm going to report out on what the JPL library is doing and how we've been leading the open science movement for several years. So yeah, there's my opening slide. Next slide, please. So a little bit of course, being a librarian, I had to add a good table of contents. So going to talk about, why open science? Why are we doing all of this? What's the point? What's the impetus? What's the motivation? We're going to talk about both open science and fair data initiatives. I'm going to explain a little bit about the differences and similarities and what we're doing around there. I'm going to go into data science activities. We've been kind of playing in the data science sandbox for a few years now, and people often confuse us for data scientists, which I think is quite a compliment and also quite indicative of the broadening out of our profession. I'm going to focus for a few minutes on open access, which really is the bread and butter of librarians. This is sort of the aspect of open science that we have concentrated on over the past actually decade and a half, or maybe even 2 decades. I'm going to talk about a really unique relationship we have with our knowledge officer, chief knowledge officer, which is situated in the office of the chief engineer. And then I'm going to talk about 3 external activities that I had the privilege of either spearheading or participating in. The Data Citation Community of Practice, also NASA's Ethical AI Initiative, which is really gaining traction. There was a Office of the Chief Scientist memorandum that came out about a week and a half ago on responsible AI. I'm going to talk about the difference between responsible AI and ethical AI and why all librarians should be paying attention to ethical AI right now. Lastly, I'm going to talk about the open science session at the American Geophysical Union 2021 fall meeting. And also within that particular discussion, I'm going to talk about why I no longer go to library conferences. You might find that particular piece interesting as well. Next slide, please. So a little bit about JPL. Next slide. For those of you who are not familiar with Jet Propulsion Laboratory, we are what's called an FFRDC. We're a federally funded research and development center. And there are dozens of FFRDCs all around the federal government. What an FFRDC is a partnership between an agency of the federal government, the Department of Energy, Department of Defense, NASA, there are several of them. It's a partnership between an agency and either a university or private corporation. Many of you may have heard of the RAND Corporation in Santa Monica, and they also have offices elsewhere. RAND is an FFRDC. You may have heard of the Aerospace Corporation. Aerospace is an FFRDC. Lawrence Livermore Lab, Sandia Lab, Fermilab. A lot of them end with the word lab. Applied physics lab, things like that. These are all FFRDCs. JPL is NASA's only FFRDC. We are a partnership between NASA and the California Institute of Technology. We actually began as a chemical propulsion and rocketry lab, a chemistry lab at Caltech. We were founded in 1936. We sort of coined the term Jet Propulsion Laboratory in 1936. And we are located fairly close to campus on a tiered hillside in what's called the Arroyo area of Pasadena. And Theodore von Karman was a chemistry and rocket propulsion professor at Caltech, and he had a whole cadre of students and followers and hangers-on. And in the mid to late 30s, rocketry, rocket propulsion really was almost a thing of science fiction. And to make this a reality, to realize rocket propulsion was a big deal, because up until then, remember, airplanes had propellers. That was the fastest you could go. And so to develop this rocket propulsion technology, we were doing all kinds of experiments, blowing things up. I mean, the hillside, the Arroyo, really, there was nothing out here except rabbits and raccoons and maybe a mountain lion on occasion. So because of the development in this rocketry, the Army took notice and sort of conscripted JPL, and we became part of the US Army with their JATO, Jet Assisted Takeoff program. And indeed, in World War II, you see the rise of jet aircraft, warplanes with jet-powered engines, as opposed to propellers. And that continued through the end of World War II into the Cold War. And in 1958, we became part of the very, very newly founded NASA, and in reaction to the launch of Sputnik. Remember, the Russians, the Soviet Union, launched the very first successful satellite into orbit, which was Sputnik. And the space race was on, and the United States government figured they needed a cheap and reliable and consistent way of getting out of the Earth's atmosphere and into orbit. They saw what the Army was doing with jet-assisted takeoff and jet airplanes, and they figured, wow, instead of vertical, let's just go horizontal, and we can use this rocketry for getting into orbit. So we've been part of NASA ever since 1958. We have a wonderful relationship with NASA. We are all, in fact, we're all Caltech employees. Our paychecks say Caltech, our retirement plans, our healthcare plans all say Caltech, because effectively we work for the Jet Propulsion Laboratory of Caltech. We're given our funding and marching orders from NASA. So that's a little bit of history of how that relationship happens. Next slide, please. And so by way of introduction for myself, I have been in the library business for over 30 years. I got my first job in libraries in 1991 in a public library, and got my MLIS degree from San Jose State University in 1997. My bachelor's degree is in cello performance. So I'm still a working musician. I'm still a cellist. I'm a freelance musician around Los Angeles, and it's sort of both my therapy and my other job. So it's sort of what keeps me balanced when things get very stressful at JPL. Over my 30 years in libraries, I've worked in public libraries, special libraries, but I've spent the majority of my career in higher education. I started at the University of Southern California in 1999, transitioned to Pasadena City College, and then I spent almost 15 years at California State University, Dominguez Hills, which is one of the California State University system campuses in Carson, California. I was the information literacy coordinator there for my entire tenure there, and really saw the change over time in information literacy. We started, it was called information competency instruction, or bibliographic instruction, BIs, for those of long timers in the audience. And then after about 25 years in libraries, I realized, I've got some ideas. I'd like to run my own shop, and came across the position at JPL. Very, very, very different than what I was used to as a tenured faculty member at Cal State Dominguez Hills, what they want from a library, what they need from librarians, the research process. I'm still learning every single day, and I'm being challenged every single day. I have a marvelous staff of 9 people, some librarians, some technicians, who really run the library, and I advocate for them and I support them, and I come up with all kinds of things for them to do. I joke with them that my job is to not only to sing their praises, but to add to their workload. So I think I'm doing a good job on both ends. Next slide, please. So back to the topic of open science. What's the point? Why are we doing open science? Some of you are not only familiar with open science, you've already had both feet in open science for years. Some of you may be new to the concept of open science. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what open science is and why we're doing it at JPL, why NASA is so invested in open science, just by way of a very, very, very brief definition. Open science means access for all to both the process and product of science, of research, from conception to publication, to comment, to building on that publication, to sharing of knowledge on down the road. Access for all, saying that we have here at JPL is as open as possible and as closed as necessary, because there are some things that we do need to keep secret, under wraps, that we're not able to share because of certain restrictions in the federal government. So next slide, please. Open science has really blossomed at NASA over the past 4, 5, or 6 years. Many of you are familiar with the OSTP, the Office of Science and Technology Policy from the White House, their guideline on open science and public access to federally funded research products and science products. Oh, by the way, I do want to mention that I have already sent all of these slides to Kara and her team, and I would like to make my slides available to everyone in the spirit of open science. So anyone who wants them can download them. I'm not sure if you're going to post them on a website, but everything in red is a link. All these links are live. So if you download these slides, you can click on these links and see all the documents that I'm talking about. So first linked is the OSTP guidelines on open science. The Science Mission Directorate of NASA has come out with a statement, in fact, carved out some staff for their open source science initiative. And their tenets are transparent, accessible, inclusive, and reproducible. The accessible piece is governed by federal policy. This is the ADA, Americans with Disabilities Act. Also, this statement from the website, open source science requires a culture shift to be more inclusive and transparent, which will increase the pace and quality of scientific progress. So part of the reason we are so committed to open science is that we want to not only speed up the pipeline of research production, but also the quality. So within the OSSI office, they have the TOPS Transform to Open Science Community Building Effort. And TOPS is the branch of OSSI dedicated to communication, to capacity building, to community building. We've been involved, JPL Library has been involved in TOPS for about 1.5 years or so since its inception. So please check them out if you are interested in open science at NASA. And at the bottom is the American Geophysical Union statement on open science. AGU is one of the largest, if not the world's largest, planetary and earth science professional association. They publish, oh gosh, a couple dozen peer-reviewed journals. They run several conferences. Their largest one is the fall meeting every year. It's an international community, even though they say American Geophysical Union. It's a wonderful, wonderful organization. Not only do they have a very strong and solid data science wing or branch. They have an associate vice president dedicated to data science. They also have a very strong DEIA, diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility mission focused foundation. They have an ethics and equity center with a vice president of ethics. I'm very, very impressed with AGU. So if any of you are interested in getting involved, perhaps in a non-library association, I encourage you to take a look at AGU. I've been a member for a number of years. There are other space-oriented associations, professional associations, but AGU is one of the first ones out of the gate with a DEIA statement and also a very strong data science orientation. So you can take a look at their open science, their statement as well. Next slide, please. So a little bit about open and fair. A lot of people kind of conflate fair data with open science, and there is a structural difference. There's a definitional difference. Fair data, FAIR is an acronym that stands for findability, accessibility, interoperability, and reusability. And it started off referring to data sets only. And of course, open science, you mentioned open science, is access for all to the process and product of research activities. They are different. So next slide, please. So this is a list of some of the open science and fair data activities involved in that we are spearheading, actually. I'm going to talk about open science in a few minutes. Open data, we got involved with open data about 3 or 4 years ago when JPL authors were starting to come to us for help placing their data in appropriate repositories, getting published in journals, because more and more journals are requiring that authors place their data sets that are referred to in the publications, that they place them in publicly accessible data repositories so that people can find and examine and download and reuse the data and replicate the results in the journal article. This led to a number of strategic partnerships here at JPL, mostly with our data governance working group and our information technology section. Several computer scientists and data scientists worked with us to find solutions to this data problem, because the reason we were having a problem is that the researchers who were working in very domain-centric or discipline-centric areas, very, very specific and very narrow fields, had no problems placing their data. The repositories for very narrow discipline areas were already out there. It was the multidisciplinary, it was the interdisciplinary science that was kind of hanging us up, because, well, we had access to the NASA data repository, the NASA data initiative. We also consulted with the Caltech library on the Caltech repository, but those really weren't ideal solutions. There were various roadblocks and procedural issues, hurdles that we had to kind of leap over. And so back in January of 2020, I convened a meeting of these IT leaders, data science and computer science leaders, and I laid out the problem statement. We need a place to put more and more of JPLers' data, both so it's publicly accessible, but also like an internally locked down sandbox so that people can trade, can view, can work with without being under the scrutiny of the public eye. And we have this wonderful partnership where we are developing our own public data repository. So I'm going to talk about that in a few minutes as well. We also deal with open code and open tools. We're a big GitHub user. We use Overleaf and Jupyter Notebooks. Open code, this also goes back to the JPL Open Repository. I did want to take a moment to kind of separate the concept of open science and fair data. So you can have data that is fair, that is findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable, but is not necessarily open. Think of it in the context of data sets that are secure, that are business discreet, that are not accessible by the general public, but within the confines of an organization, they are immediately findable. You have excellent search tools. They are accessible. People with the right authority or the right access can use the data. It is interoperable between systems and it is reusable, but just sort of locked down within an enterprise. So just because data is fair, it does not mean it's open. And just because something is open doesn't mean it's built along fair principles. I hope that clarifies the difference for people who are kind of scratching their heads and thinking, oh, I thought they were the same thing. Next slide, please. So I'm going to talk a little more deeply about some of our activities and partnerships with our various data science entities at JPL. Next slide. So when I started at JPL, this is only about 5 years ago, I was handed the chair of the Ontology Working Group. And I was told that I was going to be the chair of the Ontology Working Group because my predecessor, who had just retired, had founded the Ontology Working Group, and therefore that fell to the head of the library. With my experience, my 20 years in higher education as an information literacy librarian, I wasn't familiar with ontologies. I knew about taxonomies, I knew about metadata, but I had never made the leap to ontologies. For those of you who aren't familiar with the concept of ontologies, I mean, again, this is a very, very high level explanation. Essentially, excuse me, that's my phone. Essentially, an ontology is a taxonomy, is a group of terms linked by relationships. So you think of if you have a control vocabulary or a taxonomy, just a group of related words or terms or subjects, how does each of those terms relate to the other? And those lines, those linkages, all have descriptions of those relationships. So relationships such as feeds into, is related to, works for, reports to, things like that. So those relationships are what make an ontology. And these are crafted into something called a knowledge graph, and they're actually quite powerful. These are powering a lot of the search functionalities that we use online. Google has a knowledge graph, Wikipedia has a knowledge graph, IMDb, the International Movie Database, has a knowledge graph. Really, it's a very, very powerful yet fairly straightforward piece of semantic technology. So I was handed this working group and I went into listening mode, I went into learning mode, and really worked with our computer scientists and data scientists on ontologies and taxonomies and other initiatives. We did a name change a couple of years ago. We turned it into the Semantic Technology Community of Practice because more and more metadata and taxonomy subjects kept coming up, also knowledge graphs. It wasn't just ontologies, so we changed the name. This is just one of the data governance partnerships. I mentioned that we are crafting our own data repository. We have DOI minting. We started in that line of work about 8 or 9 months ago as part of the data repository development. Again, data placement, we are much more adept at working with scientists and authors for where to put their data sets so they can get published. We have a number of taxonomy initiatives. Over my few years at JPL, I kept getting requests for, oh, we need a taxonomy for this, we need a taxonomy for that. So finally, I hired a taxonomy librarian 2 years ago. And she's fantastic. She came in with all kinds of taxonomy and metadata development experience, and we put her straight to work partnering with our data scientists to develop taxonomies using a product called Pool Party. Some of you may be familiar with Pool Party. It's a taxonomy development, taxonomy harvesting, and knowledge graph product. There are a number of other products out there. We happened to settle on Pool Party a couple of years ago, and that's what we use for this. But we have really a taxonomy business. We want to develop it into a full-blown service for JPL. And then I mentioned the JPL Open Repository design as another partnership. Next slide, please. So the JPL Open Repository, as I said, came from a number of requests from JPLers not knowing where to put their data, needing help, my staff needing help in placing data, and also requests from JPLers around how can we view each other's data sets, how can we view each other's journal articles without having to rely on a subscription, maybe a pre-publication or preprint edition. How can we share these documents? How can we bundle both articles and data sets and tools and code so that these are all searchable? And we, as I said, we came up with the idea of this open repository that has varying layers of access and security. So the next slide, if you will, really talks about details for the JPL Open Repository. Again, this link is live. Feel free to check out the Dataverse. So the JPL Open Repository is based on the Dataverse platform from Harvard University. It is an open source platform, and it is built on a fair data environment and foundation. So this is yet another contribution to open science that JPL is following through, as we say, internal and external sharing of knowledge. What we've done, with the journal articles, we are respecting I believe it's a 1-year embargo period before we make it publicly available to institutions. We still are working on policies. This is a relatively new venture for us. So we're kind of kicking the tires and we're rolling it off the line to see how it works. As I mentioned before, we needed a repository for multidisciplinary data sets for publication. And we settled on the Dataverse platform. We examined a number of them. We really like it not only for data storage, but you can have these various layers of security for Dataverse, both internal and external. You can bundle, as I said, code and data in publications and tools for interoperability, reusability, but also findability. You can find these bundles or these packages related to a list of keywords or a subject or an author. One a function of Dataverse that I'm very, very impressed with is the auto ingestion of full text documents. You can scan, you can feed in a PDF or a Word document or a digitally native document, and it will parse it and it will create an abstract on the fly for these documents. And this is really exciting to watch because the accuracy, the quality of these abstracts is quite high. The machine learning and AI that goes into this particular platform is quite impressive. It also does an auto issuance of DOIs, and we can capture data and store data from production to dissemination. As also, it has these wonderful search capabilities, both natural language searching, Boolean, you can search for it any way you want. So we're very, very excited about the JPL Open Repository. Next slide, please. So I'm just going to spend a couple of minutes on open access because, as I mentioned at the top, it really is the librarian's bread and butter. If you are involved at all in science publications or really any kind of publications, if you assist authors with getting published, or if you are a published author yourself, you are familiar with the various flavors of open access: green, gold, diamond, and APCs, page charges versus subscription, transformative agreements, things like that. So I'm just going to spend just a couple of minutes on what we've been doing recently with open access. So next slide, please. What we've been doing, besides really understanding what the JPL authors and researchers need from an open access experience, we have a bit of a roadshow. We have a slide presentation, and myself or a couple of my other librarians, we go to the various stakeholder groups and research groups. We have a new researchers support group here at JPL. We have our chief scientist's office here at JPL. We have a senior scientist research council, all of whom are very curious and very interested in what all of this open science thing is all about. So we do have explainer presentations where we walk people through what are page charges, what is green open access, how does it differ from gold open access, what is diamond open, what does this all mean, and what does this mean in relation to them as authors. We also talk about transformational agreements. We've been following a lot of these transformational agreements at other universities and possibly other FFRDCs, but we have not completely jumped in to these because as of now, we don't have sort of the return, we don't have the capacity. It really hasn't been really as efficient or cost effective for us to pursue these. We're reaching that tipping point though. So we are going to be dipping into transformational agreements in the next couple of years. So kind of watch this space, if you will, and it's going to be pretty exciting. One thing we have been pursuing, and this is where I do need to give a shout out to my colleague, Kara Watley, and she's been completely a joy to work with and a wonderful partner on joint subscription contracts with Caltech, with our university partner, with a number of FFRDCs that have universities as partners with federal agencies. Their libraries automatically include their FFRDC in their journal subscriptions, whether it's IP authentication or single sign-on or however they gain access to the journal full text. JPL, however, has not been doing that for several decades and for a variety of reasons. And Kara and I have been kind of digging through, trying to figure out why this hasn't been going on, how we can fix this, because we did a deep dive into our respective journal subscription collections and found some overlap in what we are already subscribing to. And we figure, hey, let's just have one subscription and let's have everybody, Caltech and JPL, let's have everybody have access to these journals and these packages, because we figure we're all one Caltech since we're all employees. So we are going publisher by publisher and talking to these folks and really showing them the benefit of having a joint subscription between the FFRDC and the university. Again, there is a precedent for this. A lot of other universities automatically pull their FFRDC into their subscription arrangements. And we are hoping to continue that growth with JPL and Caltech. It's a very exciting time. We also want to talk about a partnership with our research access team. So the research access team, or group, if you will, is a partnership with the folks that do document review. Because we work with NASA property, NASA intellectual property, NASA science, a number of our data products and our science products are discrete, are secret, are locked down, if you will. And every single publication, every single transcript, every single document, this slide presentation included, had to go through what's called a clearance process, URS, a universal release process, to be reviewed to make sure we are not giving away any kind of ITAR or export control data or secrets or anything like that. So we have an active and very close partnership with our document review team on open access, because they're the ones that review all of the journal articles that are published by JPLers. So we have a lot of natural alignments with that team, and it's been a very, very fruitful partnership. We work with them on the pipeline from clearance to our public technical report server. That one link that I did not include here, but trs.jpl.nasa.gov is the the JPL technical report server. So if you want to take a look at that, these are technical reports, some journal articles that have gone through the clearance process. So we are going to continue the research access team. It's been a very fruitful partnership. Another partnership we have with Caltech is the Open Access Week annual event. We just had it a couple weeks ago. We partner with the Caltech Library to spotlight what's happening in open access between our two libraries. We bring in guest speakers. We talk about current topics. And it's usually quite well attended and a kind of a hot item, if you will, on the calendar. So we're going to continue that in the future. Next slide. So I mentioned we do have this unique partnership with our Knowledge Management Office, our Chief Knowledge Officer. We just hired a brand new Chief Knowledge Officer a couple of years ago, and she's also just wonderful to work with. She comes from industry and considers herself sort of an honorary librarian, has been doing library work, essentially, although she's a trained chemist. And as soon as she landed at JPL, we immediately got together and began conspiring on how her office and the knowledge management system and what she hoped to do with the office, how the library can work in that capacity as well. Next slide. One thing we did was we sort of compared our two shops and looked at who we serve, how we serve them, our mission, our priorities, our output, what types of people generally work for libraries versus knowledge management offices. We actually collaborated on a paper and a presentation at the International Astronautical Congress, which is an international space conference in Paris, France, at the end of September. We just gave, this is one slide from that paper. As I think I mentioned at the top, that I've kind of stopped going to library conferences. And I will tell you why in a moment. But this is a slide from that presentation. And so you can see the difference in priorities. Again, a lot of folks conflate libraries and knowledge management. Indeed, a lot of larger libraries have a knowledge management office or a knowledge management staff or component reporting to the chief librarian. At JPL, they are separate, and also throughout NASA, they are separate. The knowledge office is governed through the Office of the Chief Engineer. For a variety of reasons, this is a longstanding structure. Whereas the library at JPL, we've actually kind of wandered around the org chart. And I'd love to hear from some of you if you want to email me where your library is on your organization chart, and have you moved? Is it a fruitful relationship? I'm completely off on a tangent right now, but that's another one of my side research areas, is looking into how to place a library in an organization. Anyway, back to the topic, partnering with our knowledge office, we did discover some interesting differences in that the library really works one-on-one with researchers, scientists, information seekers to connect them with the information that they're looking for. So it's really a one-on-one librarian to knowledge seeker or information seeker gathering information. Whereas the knowledge office or knowledge management tends to look at knowledge from a holistic or enterprise-wide viewpoint and making decisions and crafting policy for the entire organization. So it is a different function and a different focus, but we work together because one flows into the other. Many of you are familiar with the line graph from data to information to knowledge, how one builds on the other. You know, information is data in context, knowledge is information in context, or information over time, if you will. There's several different interpretations of that. So we are very, very strongly hooked in with our knowledge office, and it's become a very, very fruitful partnership. Next slide. So again, I wanted to spotlight 3 external initiatives that I got hooked in with. The way I describe sort of my own approach to librarianship, because I was a music major, I started my library as really a job to pay the bills. I often tend to look at library service from a patron point of view or a user point of view. And so I'm just continually curious about how libraries can serve users better. I don't see these as gates or blocks or walls. If I see something that will help the users at JPL, I'm going to pursue it on behalf of my staff. And I've sort of pulled my staff into a lot of these initiatives. One of these is the data citation community of practice. And again, a lot of these initiatives come from a problem statement or an issue that we just can't seem to get our heads around. So this particular one was, we have a data repository at JPL, run out of JPL, called the PODAC, P-O.DAAC. That's the Physical Oceanography Data Center. So it's all of the physical oceanographers uploading their data into this one repository. And people who write oceanography papers and publish oceanography papers will quote and cite from PODAC data. What we've been finding is that these citations don't follow any kind of standard format. And indeed, the manager of the PODAC, he has to write an annual stakeholder report and talk about how many citations are hitting on his repository. But with no standard citation format, he can't do that. So he came to me and asked for help and said, please, can we have a librarian or two on this? Just going through the past year, 2 years, 5 years, through the oceanography literature for mentions of PODAC or JPL oceanography data. And really, it was a slog. It was labor intensive, time intensive. We've hired temporary librarians. I've had my own staff on this. We've hired interns to do this. We have a really good template, an outline, and a workflow for targeting which journals and how to look for PODAC data. But it's so labor intensive. I figured, oh my gosh, there has to be an automated solution for this out there someplace. Somebody has to have applied some kind of machine learning to this. And this was back in, I believe, 2020. Oh, next slide, please. I have the timeline of how this came to be. So the data citation community of practice, again, was me presenting a problem statement to a community. The American Geophysical Union fall meeting in 2020, because of COVID, was all virtual. And there were a number of data management and data governance panels, presentations, workshops that I attended, and people had started to talk about the citation of data sets in the professional literature. And they were all saying the same thing, that there really is no automated solution to this problem, and it is incredibly labor intensive. So as I do, I got on the chat on these meetings, and I started chatting with people saying, hey, we're running into the same problem. Let's talk about this after the conference. And I went from 2 to 3 to about 5 of these different sessions and said, you know, there's a tremendous amount of energy around this. Give me your email address. I will email everybody after the conference and let's talk about this problem. Well, I did, and in January of 2021, the Data Citation Community of Practice was born. We have about 75 or 80 people from a wide variety, from publishers to researchers to librarians to scientists to data scientists, data managers, who are all grappling with this issue. So again, these are all live links. Please download the slides after this talk. You can take a look at the various papers. We have a Zenodo page with recordings of several of the workshops that we've presented online. It's an active community, it's a growing community. So if you are dealing with this problem of citation of data sets in the literature, you can shoot me an email or contact any of the organizers, and we will be happy to add you to the list. I'm very, very proud to be at really at the ground level of this community of practice, because we've uncovered more and more use cases, and we're starting to talk about really viable solutions to this problem. Next slide, please. Responsible and ethical AI. So next slide. I mentioned in my intro that all librarians need to be on top of this, need to be interested in this. So ethical AI and responsible AI. So artificial intelligence touches just about every aspect of electronic information that we encounter, from online searches to push notifications to what we get through our phones to social media. Everything is going through some kind of AI algorithm to filter and focus and guide what kinds of information we are presented with. Either the information goes through this filter or the AI is actively creating the information. So I realized this, and when I saw that NASA had a very nascent, very budding team workflow and plan and mission in ethical AI, I jumped on it immediately because librarians, we have a grounding in information ethics. We are acculturated in the ethics of, equity of access, patron privacy, quality collections, all of it. So information ethics is really who we are at our core. So because information nowadays is going through these AI algorithms, absolutely librarians must be involved with ethical AI at every level to ensure that the information that we are curating is of the highest quality. So what I did was I got involved with the ethical AI team at NASA. Ed McClarney is a computer scientist at NASA Langley, and he is spearheading all of this. Again, all of these links are live. So we published a technical memorandum. I was on the review team for the memorandum. NASA SMD, Science Mission Directorate, also has an ethical AI initiative really built on the Ed's team, the work that we're doing. And I had the privilege of presenting a paper. It's really an introduction to what we've been doing with Ed and Yuri and at Langley and at Goddard, and it's a NASA-wide initiative. So COSPAR, the Committee on Space Research Scientific Assembly, was in Athens, Greece this year, and so I traveled to Athens to give a presentation on what we were doing around ethical AI. Just a couple weeks ago, the NASA Office of the Chief Scientist put out their responsible AI plan, really based on the work that we've been doing with AI ethics. And I want to take a moment to distinguish what's the difference between ethical AI and responsible AI. Ethical AI, as it's unfolding, this is a very turbulent, mercurial space. As it stands now, ethical AI really has more to do with quality algorithm development, really under the hood stuff, the computer science part of AI, making sure that it is free of inherent bias, free of actual harm to users, really looking at the development of the algorithm, who's developing, and what is their mission, what are their marching orders, if you will. Responsible AI looks at a much broader concept of really a 10,000-foot level, if you will, on the culture, on the ethos, on the ecosystem of artificial intelligence, who's being touched by it, how do people use artificial intelligence, what types of products or processes have AI underpinning them, and is there harm to users? Are they benefiting users? It's really sort of a much broader cultural framework than ethical AI. Ethical AI is much more specific. So we're kind of tackling it from both a much higher and a very specific level. And again, I would encourage anybody who is passionate about information ethics to look into AI ethics and responsible AI and possibly spearheading that within your own institutions. Next slide. So we're running up to the hour, so I just want to talk very briefly about the NASA Planetary Data Ecosystem Review Board. Next slide. I had the privilege of being co-chair on this effort 2 years ago. The Planetary Science Division at NASA had a problem on their hands. They had a lot of planetary science data that had been floating around. Some of it was organized, some of it wasn't organized. And these are all intellectual and information assets from NASA. This is, if you live in the United States, this is our tax dollars at work. And so they commissioned this independent review board to make recommendations around how do we get our arms around all of the planetary data? How do we organize it? How do we make it available? How do we infuse a fair data underpinning, a grounding, a philosophy to what we're doing? A lot of it already had fair data principles around them. Some of it didn't. Also, the open science underpinning, how much of it followed open science grounding, and some of it didn't. So again, these are live links to the final report, and we also presented a sort of an introduction and summary of the Planetary Data Ecosystem Review Board. I had the privilege of working with data scientists, with planetary scientists from around the world, because really this is a global concern and a global effort, and we made some, I think, very high quality and actionable recommendations for this review board. So if you have any questions on that, don't hesitate to contact me. I can talk about the PDE IRB all day long. Next slide. So the last external effort that I want to talk about is the open science session at the American Geophysical Union Fall Meeting 2021. And before I dive in, I'm just going to spend 120 seconds talking about why I no longer go to library conferences. After 31 years in the field, I realized that I needed to be amongst my users. I needed to have more interplay and interaction with the people that were using my library. Remember, I've only been at JPL for 5 years after 20 years in higher education. So my learning curve is going up exponentially. And I thought, what better way to do this than to go to a couple of science conferences and get involved with science professional associations. And I mentioned AGU for a variety of reasons. I really, really appreciate what they're doing in the area of data science, as well as ethics and diversity and equity. So I organized a half-day session on open science last December in New Orleans. Oh, thank you, Kara. So these are just a little overview of what we did for the half-day session. We had a keynote for both open science and for fair data. We talked about what are the benefits, why people should kind of hook into open science and publishing and open access. We had 4 diamond open access publishers, which I've spotlighted here. We talked about fair data, the history of fair data practices in NASA. We also had a keynote speaker on DEIA in open science. His name is Sean Burns. He's from the University of Kentucky. He's a fantastic speaker. You can look him up on Twitter. Yeah, it went really well, and I'm very, very proud to have presented this, because I think it moved the ball forward, and it really informed people about where open science has come, how far it's come, and really where it's going in the future. Next slide. So I started talking about at the beginning, why open science? We got our marching orders, we have our policies, but what's in it for us? What's in it for libraries? What's in it for librarians? Next slide. So looking at open science from the other side. And number one, it's expanding our scope. Because open science touches on really everything we do, as I mentioned, the process and product of the research and science that we're producing. We look at it in terms of information science, data science, knowledge management. We've been able to partner with all of these different entities within our organization. And because of that partnership, because of that seat at the various tables, we've been able to lend our voice in different areas and really make people aware of what librarians can do, what we have the capacity to do. When we started this a few years ago, a lot of my colleagues still thought of the JPL library as essentially a book repository. You know, we had journal articles, and we did interlibrary loan, and we had events. It was a very sort of traditional viewpoint of a library. And we really have broadened our reach through really busting down doors and demanding a seat at the table, saying, this is what we do, this is what we should be doing for JPL. So we've influenced JPL and NASA policy. We've, again, come together with various space agencies and space societies talking about what librarians can do for researchers. And we really have raised the profile of the JPL library. Now, when I talk to colleagues at JPL and around NASA, we're really recognized as a 21st century service. And we really have changed the concept of how people think about libraries. We've broken down barriers. And at the end of the day, the bottom line for me is we are serving our users more effectively. Next slide. So I hope in the next just few minutes, I hope there's some items in the chat or some questions. I'd like to hear from you how you open science. Next slide. And I realize I've kind of broken a cardinal rule. I hate using nouns as verbs, but I'd like to hear if you want to send me a message on LinkedIn or on Twitter or by email. Where do you work and how does your institution promote open science, or do they limit it? Is there buy-in? What are you most proud of? And what are some surprises you've encountered in open science? So next slide. This is how you can keep in touch with me. I'd love to hear from anyone who's on the call today. Feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn. I am on Twitter, but usually my Twitter kind of goes between the professional and the personal, so I didn't add that here, but feel free to shoot me an email or shoot me a message on LinkedIn. I would love to hear from any of you on this call. Thank you very much.
Hi, everyone. We have, I think, just a couple of minutes. If any of you have any questions, you can use the Q&A feature, and I will help moderate for Caroline. Oh, you just got some applause, Caroline.
Thank you. I mean, I can talk about any of the things I just mentioned all day long. So I know we don't have all day.
We've got about another minute if anybody has any questions. If there are no questions, then I will just thank you all for attending today's session. This recording will be available on the STL YouTube channel, and the link is on the screen, and we will also share out the slides with all of the attendees. Thank you all again, and all of our thanks to you, Caroline, for this wonderful presentation. Have a great day, everyone.
Pleasure. Thank you, Kara. Thanks everybody for coming.